iRobot came to mind for me recently when my landlord called to complain about the noise after a friend and I were playing a Wii game with particular zeal. It reminded me of the game's iconic giant floating head and its no jumping law, a wonderfully strange image that has stuck with me for decades. Though I didn't play it much at the time, apparently my experience of seeing it in the arcade at all is unusual. It was a pretty rare machine, and how one would make its way to the Bangor main game room I frequented, I'll never know. What I remember of the game most is how bubblingly full of itself it was. The same attract screen with that no jumping line also boasted, and rightfully so mind you, that it was the first arcade game featuring true three-dimensional graphics with no hidden surfaces. I remember that phrase exactly just for its unusual specificity. It reminds me of pre-Star Wars movie trailers that literally told you with flying titles and breathless narration how hilarious the writing was and what a wonderful job all the actors did. The game itself is actually pretty fun. Despite the title, the story, such as it is more Phil Dick than Asimov, with some Orwell thrown in for flavor. The game was released around 1984 after all, a year which contained as many winking references to its namesake novel as you might imagine. Stylistically, the game's a 3D platformer in its most literal sense. The protagonist is a little robot, too blocky to really be called cute, doomed to bounce across a series of, well, platforms floating in space, and yes, there were these bits in between where you played more of a vertical shooter, blasting apart undecorated polyhedrons while en route to the next stage. Each platform is ruled by the sinister, wait for it, Big Brother, who manifests on every level as a big, scary eyeball. Your goal was simply to have the little robot zip across all the platform's red-colored spaces while avoiding or zapping your equally blocky enemies, and the whole time you had to keep an eye on the eye. Traversing the board meant jumping across myriad little gaps, but if you jumped while the eye was wide open, it would blast the poor robot into its component polygons. The game does at least a couple things that I don't recall seeing elsewhere, not even in modern 3D platformers. My favorite feature is the fact that you have manual control over the camera's height and angle. You'd use the start buttons for that, actually. And the lower you dared angle the camera, the more points you get for doing everything, since the further away from a bird's eye view you have, the harder it is to see everything going on. That's pretty clever. iRobot was so confident of its visual appeal that it offered a special mode called Doodle City, where for the same price of a normal game, you could spend a few minutes playing with all the game's objects, using the controls to make them tumble around in space, creating patterns. When you got tired of it, you could drop back into blowing things up, but you'd be docked some of your extra lives depending upon how long you spent doodling. This was not far beyond the days where you could blow people's minds with a CG rendition of a rotating teapot, so I guess being able to rotate a blocky dude's head all by yourself with a joystick had some merit, and I will admit I did pay a quarter once to do it myself. According to a 1994 interview with Dave Toyer, the game's designer, people would sometimes tell him of having meaningful experiences with Doodle City after dropping acid. iRobot turned out to be an unusual midpoint in Toyer's early career. He had made his name 3 years earlier by designing the much better-known games Missile Command and Tempest, and he'd come to establish himself in a separate field many years later with Debabbilizer, a professional media editing software package that's still available and supported today. iRobot, though, was released just as the mid-1980s video game crash was getting into full swing, and it seems that it got lost in the noise. Arcades would keep the video game candle lit until home consoles re-emerged, but they would do so with colorful multiplayer innovations like Gauntlet. It just wasn't an auspicious time for such an experimental work as iRobot. Its variety of oddball single-player charm can be seen again, though, throughout today's indie games, in free Flash games and $10 shareware titles, ubiquitous now because it's become relatively easy for any reasonably clever individual to install a software toolkit and make their game ideas real. It's fitting that, after Toyer went through great effort more than 20 years ago to produce this largely forgotten forebearer, he'd go on to help produce the very sorts of tools that make the creation of digital worlds today so much easier by comparison.
This has been another installment of Jmac's Arcade. For more information, show archives, or to subscribe, visit arcade.jmac.org. Play Volity games at volity.net.